Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Truth Perspective. My name is Corey Schenk, and joining me on the show today is Harrison Keeley.
Hello.
On last week's show, we discussed a book called First Sight, ESP and Parapsychology in Everyday Life. So, as the title suggests, it is a book that pretty much turns the fields of parapsychology and psychology on their head by looking at things like clairvoyance, ESP, telepathy, and viewing them not as unpredictable, illusory, or dangerous, but as just basic parts of every person's daily experience. So we've discussed a lot of the technical terms on last week's show, so I would highly recommend, if you haven't listened to that already, to go ahead and check it out. But just to give a little bit of that background, just for anybody who's still getting up to speed, the author was Dr. Jim Carpenter. He's a clinical psychologist still in practice and a research parapsychologist with decades of experience in the field. And so he came at it from the perspective of somebody who's been trying to wrench meaning from the suffering of normal people in their lives as a clinical psychologist, and also to wrest meaning from the often crazy experiences of people who exhibit ESP or PK, and how it can be studied within the laboratory and what that means for everybody's life. And so he came up with a lot of technical terms, or he used a lot of technical terms in order to explicate his theory. And so I'm just going to go ahead and read a paragraph that kind of lays that all out, short and sweet, so that everybody is on the same ground for this conversation. So he writes, I think the following constructs are useful in accounting for some aspects of how the mind works in producing experience and behavior out of unconscious processes: meaning, intention, prehension, weight, signing, and somatosensory. Meaning means what we ordinarily take it to mean, and while intention refers to the goals that someone is aiming to realize. Intentions can be unconscious, and these are especially important in the functioning of psi. Prehension means to grasp, and psi is a form of an unconscious prehension, though it is not the only kind, since you can have subliminal prehensions and other kinds of unconscious prehensions. But weight means that the mind unconsciously senses that something prehended is important or unimportant to some degree, in light of one's intentions in the context of the situation. Signing can be either positive or negative, and means that something that is prehended is either included or excluded, i.e. avoided, in your experience or your behavior. So if something that is prehended is heavily weighted, its contribution, either positive or negative, will be strong and potentially obvious. If lightly weighted, its contribution will be negligible. Somatosensory refers to that sphere made up of all the things that impinge in some way upon the physical organism with its sensory systems. Extrasomatosensory refers to the universe beyond that ken, a universe that we are in touch with all the time. So that is the ultimate takeaway from that book, was that in our everyday life, we are in constant contact, although completely unconsciously, with a world of information that is not available to our senses, and that we pick up on that through ESP and through PK and various other forms of psychic, what you would call ability, I suppose, but that we don't normally get into register into our consciousness just because it's not relevant, or we don't need it. It's not as important as other forms of information. And so on this week's show, we're going to discuss some of the implications that this theory has for different fields, especially evolution and the clinical setting, the psychotherapeutic setting. So with that, Harrison, do you have any thoughts on where you want to go with that?
Yeah, first I just want to kind of expand on your introduction a bit to give some examples to kind of place those concepts in, in the sphere of actual practical reality, like concrete reality. So last show I gave an example, mistaking a stick in the forest for a snake, for instance. And I gave that as an example of how this kind of process works. And I was thinking about that some more, prompted by a question. And so I just want to kind of clarify that as a way of, providing an example of how Carpenter basically says the mind works. So to start out with, he uses, or he references the vast literature on unconscious processes, which has been going on for decades now. It's it's pretty confirmed in the scientific community, the fact that, for instance, subliminal information can affect your physiology, your emotions, and your cognition, essentially. And you can do that by priming people, like we talked with last week, with emotionally relevant images that they're not consciously aware of seeing, but they respond physiologically as if they were conscious of it. So they might start sweating more. They'll show various physiological signs of arousal of one sort or another, and that can affect their decision making in various conditions. And there's just a vast amount of literature to confirm that there are unconscious processes going on all the time that, as Carpenter says, seem to be, if not conscious, they are still intelligent. Like these processes are going on as if this unconscious part of yourself is on its own conscious to some degree. It has its own intentions, has its own sense of agency. It's goal-directed, basically, and it responds. It responds and interacts with the world according to like meanings and purpose, like he says. So if we have an example of how that works, he basically says that using all this literature to confirm it or to support it, that at any given moment, what goes into the creation of a conscious experience it's basically like a holistic mingling of all different kinds of streams of information. So you have memories, you've got your immediate feelings and sensations, and you've got your conscious beliefs and knowledge, which is tied into memory. All this is tied into memory, of course, because you can't do anything without memory. You can't communicate, you can't think, because even to think one thought requires the span of memory it takes to start and finish that thought. And then when you get into long-term memory, like you need memory in order to be conscious. And but in addition to that, he says that there are these psi impressions, psi information, psi-derived information that is basically received by the mind in some way. The mind grasps out and receives that information, and he argues that it receives like pretty much all available information. We can get into that in a second. And then the way that consciousness seems to work is to highlight the most important and relevant information for the unconscious and conscious goals in the moment. So if something isn't relevant in the moment, it won't be perceived or weighted as important. And if it is important, it'll be weighted either positively or negatively to either bring it to consciousness or not. And all these streams of information are entering into any conscious moment, and maybe their relative strengths will be determined on a case-by-case basis, in the context of the moment. So, for example, the way he'd say that psi might come into it would be, he gives the example, I think we gave it last time, of like a tiger in the forest and either being aware of it subliminally or not. But maybe just to use another example, I'll say maybe you're walking through a minefield, and you're not sure, you don't know that you're walking through a minefield. In this hypothetical scenario, what he would be saying would be, if some kind of psi exists, if some kind of like non-sensory information is being received in this moment, of course, like a mine in the path that you're walking will be highly relevant to you personally, because you might die if you step on it. So he would say in that situation, an individual might receive that like piece of psi information, like the mind is grasping out into the world for potential meanings. That is a highly meaningful piece of information potentially. So the way that so that's the first step. It gets weighted as important, but whether it gets signed positively or negatively, well, let's look at an example of that. So if it gets signed negatively, that means it's important, but it doesn't enter into the conscious experience. At the same time, it might be signed positively. I don't know what he'd say about this, because it can affect behavior without coming to consciousness. I'm not sure if he'd say that's signed positively or not. I can't remember how he would distinguish that. But you can imagine, for instance, like walking along this minefield, not realizing it, you're coming up to a mine, and then all of a sudden you just kind of lose your balance and you trip, and you trip over the mine, whereas if you wouldn't have tripped over it, you would have stepped on it. And you might just think, oh, well, wow, that was weird. I just kind of lost my balance there for a second, having no awareness whatsoever that you just avoided total disaster. He would consider that like coincidence, an example of psi-derived information that is resulting in an inadvertent behavior on your part. You're not sure why you did what you did, but it was significant in the sense that you just saved your life without knowing it. Now, in the case of when you, like a misperception, when you see like a vague shadow and you're not sure what you see, and so your mind kind of plays tricks on you, this would be an example of, like, if there's nothing really there, I think what Carpenter would probably say is that, there's no kind of psi-derived information coming from it because it isn't relevant on a subliminal level. That might just be a stick in the, in the bush, or that might be just a person-shaped shadow, like, cast by maybe a mannequin, or just, some random collection of objects that by chance happens to make a human-formed shadow. So on a psi level, on the unconscious, non-sensory level, that won't be weighted as a positive thing because there's no actual relevance to it. The relevance comes when you actually when you see the vague information. So now you have like a concrete sensory, like instantaneous, like, because this happens in a split second, right, where you see something and you get that startled response right away. So in that case, there might not be any psi type information going on, but it's still activating the same kind of unconscious processes because subliminal and psi information acts subliminally in the same ways. They act subliminally in the same ways. So you see that, and it's a vague sensory picture, right? And what he says is when there's uncertainty, when there's vagueness, the mind then searches for meanings. It searches for potential meanings. Well, what could that be? Well, that could be a person, and that looks kind of shady, and that could be dangerous. That could be a snake. That could be very dangerous. So it prepares your body for a response by basically just cycling through like a catalog, essentially, again, dependent on memory, of potentially significant things that vague stimuli could be representing. And so it prepares you for that action. It's not necessarily going to be right. It could just be a guess. So this kind of ties into the work that like Daniel Kahneman and guys like him have done on the adaptive unconscious, Timothy Wilson too, on how like these unconscious processes are basically heuristic. They aren't perfect. They look at a situation and kind of go for the best bet. Sometimes it's wrong, but it ends up being advantageous because you're better off being wrong in the sense of being scared of something that's not there than you are of not being scared of something that is there. It'll pay off, essentially. So in that case, you've got all of these, in those instances of behavior and of experience, you've got all these streams of information coming in from the senses, from memory, because your memories are contributing to your perception, just even so that you know what you're looking at. Because you can't know what you're looking at if you don't remember what that form actually is, right? You can't recognize your friends if you don't remember what they look like and who they are and what kind of people they are. And that applies to every situation. So memory is a great contributor to the construction of a conscious experience. And Carpenter would add that psi, too, is a contributor to all conscious experience, but you just don't necessarily see it all the time, because it gets fully incorporated into the conscious experience. And by the time you're consciously experiencing something, you've got that sensory confirmation of whatever psi might have been there. So you don't recognize the psi because you have the experience. You've got the conscious sensory experience. You have no need for psi and no way of detecting it because it's kind of like submerged within and underneath the actual experience that you're having. So I just wanted to give those examples just to kind of give a way of seeing how it might work in actual concrete examples. And then, so if we move on to like the topic that we want to get into today, these kind of, well, we'll see how much we get into them. We might have to do another show at some point. But he's got a chapter in here on basically how this works in the consulting room. First Sight in the Consulting Room is the name of the chapter. And he's got a great talk that he gave at like the Rhine Center, I believe, a year or two ago on this very chapter. He goes a bit more in depth and gives some additional examples from basically case studies from his own experience and the experience of other psychotherapists, basically laying out how the theory applies in the wide context of psychotherapy. And so how it can help looking at situations like this, and even how it can help in like a therapeutic sense. Not only in the theory and understanding what's actually going on in psychotherapy, but how to explain certain phenomena inherent in psychotherapy, and also how in certain situations that can actually help the process. So maybe we can get into that. I recommend checking out the video. We'll try to include a link in the show description so you can watch it, because it's nice to get an idea of what Carpenter himself is like, and to see the examples, because he's a good speaker, and the stories are really good too. So we wouldn't be able to do justice by trying to give all the details of them. So at the very least, watch it for the stories, because they're pretty interesting. Maybe to start out with, before he gets into his examples, he's only got like a page on this in the book, which kind of covers most of the ideas, but it's good to see it in the video too, because he kind of expands on it. It's this theory that's been developing, I guess, pretty recently, called control mastery theory for psychotherapy, and it's kind of like an attempt to describe the kind of dynamics of psychotherapy, what's going on, how it works, and I guess why it works too. And the basic principle is that the basic principles on which the theory is based is that people are innately seeking control of their own emotional lives and mastery over their problems. So that's kind of one of the basic axioms or principles of this thing. So that when people are going to psychotherapy, it's actually because on some level they have a wish to get better, essentially. So they have some awareness that there's something wrong in their life, and some awareness, however unconscious it is, that they can get better and that they want to get better. And another axiom or principle would be that we think, decide, and plan unconsciously as well as consciously. So that's been inherent in like psychotherapy of all sorts. Back to the original psychoanalysts like Freud, that there is this unconscious thing that's kind of doing its own thing, and that it does have some kind of agency. And that maybe one more basic principle is that many people have powerful, unconscious, what he calls pathogenic beliefs that make them unhappy and ineffective. And that these are basically, the way they describe these pathogenic beliefs is that they're unconscious beliefs that form usually in childhood, that as a result of usually trauma and neglect. So, for example, you might have a kid who develops the belief that if they get too attached to people, those people will disappear. Because in their life, everyone that they got attached to disappeared from their lives. Maybe they were, their father left them, their mother committed suicide, they were put into foster homes and just, shunted from one family to the next. And anyone in their life that they actually cared about and that might have cared for them, doesn't remain as a fixture in their life. So that will create like an unconscious belief that you can't get attached to someone. It's a protective mechanism, because if I don't get attached to someone, then they can't leave me, and that bad thing can't happen. Now, of course, it's pathogenic because it isn't based in reality. Like it's a good conclusion to come to. It's not the best conclusion to come to. And it works at a time, especially for a child who can't understand all the details and all the context, and then can't see as an adult that it doesn't apply in the same way as it did when they were a child. So people who kind of follow this kind of theory would say that people enter therapy with the unconscious wish that the therapist will help them disprove these beliefs. So again, there's an unconscious awareness or desire, or first of all, there's an unconscious awareness that these beliefs are pathogenic, that they aren't healthy, and that having them dispelled would make them better. So they enter into therapy kind of like with the unconscious wish that this person that they're going to be engaging in therapy with, their therapist, will be able to help them by bringing some reality to the situation, by kind of clarifying and correcting these false beliefs that they have. So what they then do, this is kind of also a description of like the psychotherapeutic process, is that a person with these pathogenic beliefs will then carry out what they call unconscious tests on the therapist. Because they've got these beliefs, right? So now comes the testing period. It's like, okay, well, on some level, I think you're going to help me. But if that's the case, I've got to test you out first, and you're going to have to prove yourself that you can actually do what I'm hoping that you'll do. But this is often like it too is an unconscious process. Like if you ask a person in therapy why they're acting in a certain way, they won't be able to give you the answer. That's why they're going to therapy, to try to find the answer. And that's what the therapist is for, to try to give them the answer, to try to say, oh, well, you see what you're doing here. You see how this is kind of playing out to confirm or deny this pre-existing belief that you have. An example of that might be one that he gives is he had this one patient that came in and just like sat very close to him, like uncomfortably close, and that is a test. And depending on how you look at these kinds of things, you can see them as tests, manipulations, which essentially they're the same thing, or you could see them as also self-fulfilling prophecies, because a lot of these things are like that. It's like if you believe that everyone that you get close to is going to leave you, the behaviors that you have are going to be pushing them away. That's just the way these things kind of work. So right here, this woman enters his office and just sits uncomfortably close to him, or it might have been a man, I can't remember. And the test there is to see if he is going to like reject her because she's making him uncomfortable. And of course, it's a totally manipulative thing to do, and especially in everyday life, because if you don't know someone and you do that to them, they're going to be put off and they're going to be made uncomfortable, and then they're just going to confirm your pathogenic belief. So this is a test. It's like, okay, I'm going to sit close to you, and because if you do get too close to me, then you are just going to leave, and that's going to prove that I'm right. But there's a part so again, it depends on what angle you're looking at it from, right? Because on the one hand, you could say that that's the part in control, and it's actively trying to push people away. But the control mastery theory people would be saying that, no, there's actually an unconscious wish to get past this and to understand it. So it's actually a test to the therapist. If the therapist can actually maintain interest and not be put off by you, you're like, oh, wow, okay, maybe this person actually cares. And it's usually only going to be the therapist that will, in this kind of relationship, that will be able to do that, because, like I said, in everyday life, these kinds of things might be considered like unacceptable in everyday life, and you wouldn't expect some totally random stranger to put up with that kind of behavior. It's like they're just going to be like, okay, moving on, right? So that's basically what the psychotherapy, a lot of what the psychotherapeutic process is about, is the therapist or the patient constantly testing the therapist, and the therapist in every instant, like in every example of this, has to kind of like guess what the right answer might be. Okay, I think that this might be the belief that they're going for, and depending on what the belief is, it can determine whether you do one thing or the other thing. Like, because there might be a situation where someone sitting too close is doing it for a different reason, and they're basically maybe asking for correction. So it might be the right thing to say, okay, well, right now you're sitting uncomfortably close to me right now, and that's kind of not really socially acceptable, so I'm going to have to ask you to move back. So in one situation, that might be the right thing. In another, it might be the right thing just to smile and nod, essentially. That's and as he says in the book, that's kind of, a lot of psychotherapists don't like that idea, because it means that every situation is different and they don't have like simple black or white rules to follow. Always do this in this situation, always do that in this situation. So those are kind of the basics of that theory. And what he basically does is compare that to his own theory and show how they're compatible. Because, of course, his first sight theory is also that there are unconscious and conscious intentions and motivations going on all the time. That's the same between both theories. And that for first sight theory, the idea is that prehensions of this non-sensory information don't have clear content that's available to consciousness, to awareness, and that they function as kind of like orienting instructions in the creation and the construction of experience. And that almost all extrasomatic non-sensory prehensions are excluded from awareness, because whenever you have an experience, a perception, you're not seeing infinitely more things than you are seeing. You're usually focusing on a very strictly defined set of things within the direct sphere of your awareness. And then another part of first sight theory is that sensory experience is usually much more useful in achieving goals. So that's why we are usually, in the vast majority of cases, kind of tied to our bodies, to our sensory information and the conscious awareness of what is immediately around us. Is because that's what's most immediately relevant to us as physical beings. Starting with the very just survival of our bodies. That's very important in order for us to continue and to be able to keep experiencing. So it makes sense that the most immediately relevant things are going to be kind of direct sensory experiences. But the way this kind of plays out in a psychotherapeutic setting is that you've got all of this stuff going on beneath the surface that isn't available to awareness. You're not aware of your unconscious motivations. You're not aware of these pathogenic beliefs. You might have memories that you've forgotten. So a lot of things that happened in your past that you don't have conscious access to. And it's basically the therapist's role to then, as he put it, and as therapists have been, putting it for, since the beginning, to make the unconscious conscious, to see the signs in that relationship, in that dynamic, and then to bring those to light as a way of making clear the things that are usually unconscious and that the patient is not aware of.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, right, because that's why they're going into the therapist, is to figure out why they have this belief, or rather, not even necessarily to figure out why they have this belief, but to have this belief disproven to them, because they might not even know that they have this belief, but they're going in, for example, you use the example of, this guy who is convinced that everyone is going to reject him, and that there's no reason to have an attachment. And he gives the example of a man who was, I think he was abandoned as a child. He had just he remembered his parents, and then he was adopted by his grandparents. But these were two strangers to him. They obviously, the family was broken. The parents and the grandparents didn't necessarily get along, but the grandparents took him in. But then shortly after that, he's taken in by foster parents, and so his early memories are basically, as soon as you get attached to someone, then they're going to leave you. And as long as as long as your unconscious is working fairly well, you could probably just slide through life completely unconsciously. I think at some point he even speculates that the only time you really become conscious of things is when they're difficult, when you actually have to become conscious of trying to figure out what's going on. And so when you are going through your life and you keep on bumping your head into this same wall over and over again, it creates this pain, suffering for yourself, for others. Something isn't right. Consciously, you know that something isn't right, but unconsciously, your unconscious is continually trying to test this belief out, and everyone that it tests this belief out on proves the belief. I think that's the fundamental problem, is that if you think that everyone is going to reject you, and then you are unconsciously provoking people to reject you in order to prove it wrong, then most people, don't go to school for psychotherapy, and they have enough on their plates then to disprove your hypothesis, your unconscious hypothesis. So then, eventually, if you are lucky enough, or maybe perhaps through just unconscious reasoning, you go in to see the therapist. Then, when you go in to see the therapist, finally, here's somebody who is paid to sit there and listen to your nonsense and listen to you spew all this, psychoanalysis is stupid, therapy is dumb, blah, blah, blah. You have all these conscious reasons for all these conscious narratives for why you behave the way that you do. But through constantly the therapist mirroring that, then you start to get an idea of your unconscious starts to unpack what was, this belief. And then your therapist is able to disprove it. And now you have this new information to go on. And I think he says basically the therapist's job is just to repeat these tests until therapy is boring, and then you're done. And then you're like, well, there's nothing to do here anymore. This is boring. So it's time to, go back to living my normal life. But I think you were mentioning some of the things that make therapy very conducive to Psy. And one of the big things that he points out is just the safety, the fact that when you go in there, you develop this extremely, just unprecedentedly safe situation where you can risk accessing this information. If you think about it, if you think about going into therapy as trying to do this soul work, then you've created this environment where you're open to this information from wherever, and it often manifests in really strange ways. He has a list, a really excellent bibliography in the book of different books by psychoanalysts and other more modern therapists who recount all of the strange ways that the psyche appears in the therapeutic relationship, whether it's in dreams or it's just in this sense that the therapist is going to leave you. I think he mentions one aspect of Freud had a patient who once World War I, I believe, was over, Freud was going to leave and go take in other patients.
Well, no, he had a. There was a patient that was like a prominent person, some Englishman, who because the war was over, he was now able to take more foreign patients. So he was looking forward to this new patient because it was someone special, and he didn't tell anyone about it, right? But he was privately thinking, oh, this is going to be great.
Yeah, and then the patient actually, I don't remember if he had a dream about it or some sort of a premonition, but he was extraordinarily jealous. I think it was a dream where he was extraordinarily jealous of Freud because Freud was basically abandoning him for somebody else. And then when he confronted Freud with that, Freud was a little bit shocked, and he couldn't believe that this guy had this information. Where did this information come from? He hadn't told anybody. But that was just one of many examples of patients picking up on something from the therapist that was, sometimes it was, secretive, stuff that the therapist did not want anyone to find out about. And as Carpenter points out, most often they didn't post the explicit details of that in their books, but that it was something that happened relatively frequently. That this relationship, this bond that occurred between the therapist and the patient resulted in some sort of a psychic ESP connection of this information transfer of information that would be highly relevant to the patient, something that they wanted to know, something that you'd think that on an unconscious psi kind of level, that would be information that would be signed as worthy of getting to consciousness in one way or another. But as he points out, it's never that something. It's not something that you could bring to a court of law and say, I had a hunch about Freud, leaving. It's always this hunch that you can act on. You can choose to act on this kind of information, but most often, and one of the reasons why it's not something that we regularly act on, it's just a hunch. It's not. We don't really weigh it as being extremely important. It's just a sense, something that you might put into the back of your mind is like, I got this feeling. If I have a dream about something that just like the other day, I had a dream that I was going to win $35,000. I haven't won $35,000 yet, but it's just the information still has to be weighed consciously. You can't just take it and then run with it and just acting on every hunch. And he points that out in his talk too. You have to be reasonable. And as a therapist, he sometimes does use the information that comes up through psi, clairvoyance, dreams. He does use that sometimes, but just as often he'll have people come into his office and, on several occasions saying, oh, you're the psi psychologist, you're all about ESP. I have all these stories I want to tell you about ESP. And he'll sit there, and he said he'd find himself being entertained by some of these stories, but then he kind of gets this sense that, well, no, this is, he's like, well, what did you really come in here to talk about? And then that's when they start to divulge, oh, well, you know what, I have these issues going on. So it's not that psi information is the most important, but that it does provide it does provide sometimes an avenue to get at information that is otherwise completely unavailable to your conscious mind. Information you could never get at yourself. It's not recorded in any book. It's, you might not know anybody who could ever give you this information. But since for a lot of people, that are going into therapy because their life is in a crisis, this information is so critical to them. It's so salient that some part of them basically is like, anything, give me anything, and just give me some hope that there's a way out of this mess that I'm in.
Mm-hmm. I want to give a couple more reasons why. First, a couple more reasons why the therapeutic relationship is conducive to this kind of thing, and then a couple of more examples. One of the things that he mentions is like the reason that it's you mentioned that the environment is a very, very safe environment, right? Because you can share all this stuff and you can say things without judgment that usually, like if you might tell someone else, you might get in a fight, you might, your marriage might be ended, etc. But with so a therapist will listen, and that creates, an environment and a bond that isn't normal in everyday life. And as he points out, usually, like if you look at the relationship between a therapist and the patient, it is something that is usually totally alien to most people's experience, because most people don't have that kind of deep interaction where you're talking about these important things, even with the closest people in their lives. They see each other, passing through the kitchen, and how much time do they actually spend talking about the most important things with each other, and really, really paying attention with each other to each other, and listening to what's being said, and really trying to get behind everything. It's like that doesn't usually happen in everyday life. So it is it's this supercharged environment, and one of the reasons that it's supercharged is because presumably in that relationship, in that process, you are dealing with the most important thing to you. Like your life is going through a crisis. It is the most important thing to you to be able to get over this stuff, to maybe fix something in your life, to understand something in your life in order to make it better, to make yourself better. So you're dealing in this situation, in this process that is perhaps potentially the most meaningful thing in your life. And again, so that's the most important part of first sight theory, is that it deals primarily with meaning and with the most important things. So the most important things in any given moment, and that might be just pushing the right button on your stove in the morning to get the right temperature. In that moment, that's the most important thing. But in other moments, it's going to be something else, and over a wider span of time, it's going to be something completely different. So over a wider span of time, the most important thing might be, getting your life together, or figuring this thing out, or it might be a relationship problem or an issue at your job that's, that takes place over a longer span of time. So when you're in the therapeutic environment, you're dealing in a highly charged environment of the most profound and deep meaning possible in your life, potentially. So that in itself will facilitate these kinds of things, because you're looking for the most important thing. Like it's this oftentimes unsaid subtext, or overriding context to the situation that creates this charged environment in which these things can then take place. And so maybe to give a couple more examples from his own experience, like Carpenter talks about this one patient he had, a woman, and he finished one session with her. And then he, I can't remember what the details of that session were. It ended with him basically suggesting, I'd like to try to lightly hypnotize you a bit. I think this might help. And he wasn't aware of just how dissociative she was at the time. So they did that, and then she was kind of spacey when she left, but he thought everything was okay. And then he went and he had a couple more sessions with a couple other patients, and then he went off to work out. And the point he made was that none of his patients know that he works out. He doesn't say it. They don't know where he works out. And he said he works out at this kind of like obscure place where you have to, drive down a main road and then off to a side road. And then there's another main road, a semi-main road, like with businesses on it. But the gym is on the other side of the building, like basically in the alley, and you can only access it and see it from like the alley where the little parking lot is. So he was there working out. And then after he was done his workout, he went out to his car, and he saw there was a spoon a spoon on the passenger seat of his car with a note saying like something like, "I'm so glad that I found you, like you're exactly what I need," or something like that. And he just kind of thought like, "Oh, well, isn't that nice? You know, I did something right." But then, so the next day or the next time that he talks to this patient, he asks her about it, and she describes what she experienced and how she she went home and she said that at the session that they'd had, she'd had like these kind of almost uncontrollable impulses to like get underneath his desk and to like basically curl up under the desk. You know, there's probably something that she'd done as a child to hide from something, you know, is where she felt safe. But she had all these kind of like this whole process going on inside of, oh no, that I'm too old for that. That would be ridiculous, and et cetera, and kind of going back and forth about all these issues. And then so she went home and decided, okay, well, I can feel safe by going underneath my own kitchen table. So she had her, you know, her lunch underneath her own table, but then she just had like the urge to go see him again because she had to say something, or no, what she did was she found these spoons because I think it was.
I think they were her grandmother's
her
spoon.
grandmother's
Her grandmother was like this wicked grandmother.
Yeah, he said that she was like a totally malevolent person in her life, one of the worst people in her life. And this spoon, because she found like a, I can't remember if she saw that her grandmother's chest in her house, in her apartment, was open, or if she was just drawn to it for some reason. But she looked in and she found these spoons, and one of these spoons, it was the spoon that she had found in the garbage, like when she was a kid, and her grandmother had accused her of like throwing it away or like losing it or something, and she hadn't. She was the one that actually found it. And so she'd been falsely accused by her grandmother of doing something nefarious with this spoon when she hadn't. So this brought back these memories of her grandmother, who was this evil person in her life. And so she just had to talk to Dr. Carpenter about this. So she went back to his office. His car wasn't there. She couldn't find him. And so she kind of like felt like, they were dealing with sleepwalking. So I think part of the hypnotism was to bring out the sleepwalker, basically find out which part of her was doing this sleepwalking. He didn't really give details of what they found during the hypnosis, but she said that she basically decided that she didn't know where he was, but she was just going to go looking, and she kind of entered the mind space of being like a kid again and riding her tricycle. So she got in her car, and she said she just had the experience of just driving aimlessly, and it was just like, you know, almost as if there were a voice. There wasn't a voice, I don't think, in her head saying, okay, now turn here, now turn there. And so just driving on this aimless path, she stopped in this parking lot of the gym, saw his car, left him the note and the spoon, and then drove off. And so the way he describes it, it's like she didn't know where she was going, because this is the way Psy works. She was just guessing, right? At least that's the experience that she had. Oh, well, you know, I think it feels right to turn here. She doesn't know that that's the right way to go. She doesn't say, oh, well, I'm going here, and this is how I turn to get there. It was just this kind of just nudge in the right direction that she felt, and it got her to that place that was, you know, impossible for her to have found. And just so given this situation, it was very important for her at this moment to do so. And she was in a slightly more than normal dissociative state. And this played itself out so that she found and she could deliver this message. Because that was the important thing too, is finding him, having access to him, because not being able to find him would have meant, subconsciously, unconsciously, that that he was repeating the dynamic that she'd have with other people in her life, and basically not being available, and so she couldn't find that person. Also, she did have this one person in her life that was important to her, like an older female, I can't remember what relation to her, that was the stable, like, caring person in her life. And at some point, I think it might have been like her nanny or something. And at one point, she went away for whatever reason, I can't remember. And so as a child, she looked for her in the neighborhood and couldn't find her. So she had lost the most important person in her life and couldn't find that person. So this dynamic then plays out in her adult relationship with her therapist, and she found him. And that was like all these moments, that was like a pivotal moment in the therapy, to have that confirmation. It's like, so in this sense, he didn't pass the test that she was posing a test, presenting a test towards him, but he didn't have to do anything to to solve it. He just had to be somewhere, and she essentially solved it on her own, and probably because, on some level she knew that he was, well, like she said, she was glad she found him because he was, the right therapist for her. Maybe to give one other example, this is also a very interesting one. He had a male patient who was married and had a session with this guy, and I can't remember if this was the session where he was bored. Do you remember if this was the one where he was bored?
Okay, so yeah, there was I think that was the lead up to that session,
Yeah.
was he had a session with somebody. Yeah, no, that is that.
Okay,
He was
yeah.
extremely bored during that
Yeah.
session. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, so he has this session with a guy, and the only thing he can remember about it was that it was extremely boring. And he says it was so boring that he couldn't even ask himself why it was boring afterwards. He just kind of blocked it out. It was just like that. Oh God, that was the most boring hour and a half of my life. Just geez. He says, being a therapist, sometimes that happens. Unfortunately, you don't want it to happen, but it was this experience that then gave him the insight for what that might mean. But that's getting ahead of the story. So he has this boring session with this guy. And then, so he goes home that night. They've got another session planned in a few days or something. He goes home, he goes to sleep, and then he has this nightmare almost. This really charged dream. It didn't have this guy in it. It had another guy that he'd known previously that he'd dealt with. And I can't remember the details exactly of that previous patient, but there might have even been a boredom element there too. Like this other guy, he'd been bored with him previously before
Something
too.
like he was bored with him, and then he went and he attempted to commit suicide.
Yeah, this
he
previous
OD'd,
guy.
yeah.
Yeah, so he has a dream about this previous patient that he hadn't seen in years. And no, I don't think he died.
Well, he attempted, right?
Yeah, he attempted suicide, but he was probably still alive because he'd just kind of moved on from therapy after, and the guy, and so Carpenter hadn't heard from him. So he has this dream about this other guy. But in the dream, he says he realized that even though the guy looked like this previous patient, it was actually this patient that he'd just seen. He describes it as, you have dreams like that all the time where you're talking to one person who has the body of this one person, but in your dream, it's someone else, and you're interacting with them as if it's this other person. So he said that's what the dream was like. And he woke up from it, and he just was really nervous and shaking. And he said, well, this is really important. And he had the urge to call this guy. And he's like, am I going crazy? It's it's 2:30 in the morning. Can I really call this guy? And so he went back and forth in his mind, over it. And he's like, okay, well, if I call him and I am crazy and he thinks I'm crazy, well, then I guess he's just going to think I'm crazy and he's going to find another therapist. And if that's the case, I've got 10 others that I can send him to, and that's going to be fine. But yeah, I don't know. So he decided to go with his gut, and he gives the guy a call at 2:30 in the morning. He says he calls him, and his wife picks up the phone, groggy. He'd just woken her up, and he's like, I'm sorry. I'm your husband's therapist. I just need to talk to him. I'll explain it all to him. Just don't worry, And she's like, okay. So she gives him the phone. He talks to him. Oh, what? He's just woken up. And so he tells him, he's like, oh, I just had this dream. I think that's what he said. And he's like, I just felt like I really needed to, make contact with you and see how you were doing. It just felt really important. And so the guy's like, oh, okay. Goes to bed. That was it. And then the next day, I think, they have a session, and he comes in, and the patient tells Carpenter, he's like, man, I'm really confused. I don't know what to do. And he's like, well, what? And he's like, that conversation we had. And he's like, well, why? Tell me what's going on. He said that the previous day, it might have been the previous day, it might have been a day or two before, so around the time that they'd had their session, he had gotten his father's or grandfather's pistol. He knew that his wife that day, the day after Carpenter had this dream, was going to be out of town. He had sent a voicemail message to a friend that he knew wouldn't get a message for a day or two. But when they did get it, they'd get it while his wife was gone. He said he was going to kill himself. And sorry, it's emotional just putting myself in this situation.
Mm-hmm.
So he says that he had planned it all out. And he was going to kill himself that day, and his friend would get the message. His friend would be able to call the authorities and come and clean him up before his wife got there. And so he says to Carpenter, I don't know what to do anymore because I had it all planned out. And what Carpenter had done in that moment was to, reach out at the precise moment. If he hadn't done that, this guy would have killed himself for sure. He had it all planned out, and but he didn't do it. So again, just like the previous one, this was like a pivotal time in the, a crisis point that was completely like diverted, because Carpenter had just followed his intuition on this one. He had a crazy dream and decided to call this guy up, and it threw this guy into this state of confusion. And so, like what Carpenter said was good. That's good. I'm happy that you're in a state of confusion, because that's what I want right now. That's what that's where I want you to be, because he was sure of himself, right? He had his plans all set out, and what that did was that challenged that pathogenic belief, whatever it was. I can't remember if Carpenter speculated on what it might be, but it was probably something like, no one cares enough to reach out and actually be interested in me, or something like that.
Yeah, that was what he said that the pathogenic belief was that's why he was so intensely boring, was because he had learned that no one cared about his suffering or who he was. No one cared enough to find out about who he was. So he just would test that by just being completely so boring that only like someone heroic would try and inquire into who he really was and try and find out what his life was like. And so then when he got that call, that was Carpenter had just completely just smashed that test.
Yeah.
3 a.m. He's calling saying, I am worried about your suffering. He'd only met him once.
Yeah.
He'd only met him once.
Yeah,
And that one thing was what saved his life.
So he says that now, after that, he learned that if he's super bored, chances are that's the person's intention. They're trying to be super boring on an unconscious level, because that is one of these tests. And so again, like, you just meet people every day, and if they're super boring, you're going to ignore them. You're going to confirm that belief for them. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way it works. But in a relationship with a psychotherapist, if they're trained, it's like, then it's their job to basically be like, okay, well, what are you really doing here, and what is the right action to take because of that knowledge? Because I know if I can figure out why you're doing what you're doing, then what choice do I make? Because like I said, it can be different. If a person presenting the same behavior, like the same test, the correct answer to that test might be completely different in each situation, because it really does depend on the individual. So he learned that lesson. So now he pays attention if he's getting extremely bored. But then he said he asked the guy one thing afterwards, and he said, well, why did you end up even coming to the session? The one on the day that they did have, the day before he was planning to kill himself. And he said he just got this like icy look on the guy's face, tight mouth, and he just said, well, I didn't want to disrupt your schedule. So, and that was the same kind of like, boredom inducing, like, lack of connection. It was just, oh, well, I just didn't want to mess up your schedule. Like, totally shut down, right? No connection whatsoever, not being open. It was just, just business. And that was the front that this guy was putting up, when, really he just, he needed someone to disconfirm the belief that what, how did you put it? That,
that basically nobody cared enough. Nobody gave a crap about him or his experience enough to find out about who he was as a person. And he was just that icy cold, like death incarnate.
But at the same time, like, so this would be a guy that is suffering extremely, like, on the internal level, but won't give anyone anything, like, won't give them a hint, basically. Well, that's the point he makes, is that I think he kind of joked in the talk that it would be nice if a lot of these patients would give hints and be like, like, oh, I could really use some attention right now or something, or I could really use you asking me this question. And he says that some do that, some are still have that level of self-awareness to be able to engage at that level, but there are some people who are just so trapped within this pathogenic belief that they can't even do that much, and it really does take a skilled therapist to be able to see through that, and then by observing and identifying and then bringing that belief, that pathogenic belief, to light, like in therapy, by basically verbalizing it, that itself is part of the therapeutic process, is to bring that pathogenic belief to light and to be able to say, so for both of them, well, this is what you're doing right now. It seems like this is why you're doing it. And that gives some insight to the patient, who can then see themselves, see their own unconscious behaviors for what they are, and then kind of grow from that.
I think, just that story really illustrates what First Sight brings to the table in terms of like humanizing psychology, really adding that full human element of the experience that everybody has, the strange experiences that everybody has, especially with the dream, the information delivered through that dream. You have different ways of interpreting dreams, all these kind of new agey or Freudian dream interpretations. But with the theory of first sight, you get a different, it gets put into perspective, into this more holistic system regarding other unconscious processes going on, your conscious intentions, the intentions of a person as a whole. And it takes on a different kind of meaning. It's not just a bunch of interesting, symbols and this and that,
Right.
but it really drives it home how important it is to take it into the context of the intentions of the dreamer and the life that they're living, the different situations that they're coming into contact with. Like Jordan Peterson, he points out in one of his talks that, how does a dream, if a dream is me, is a conscious me, or, just another part of conscious normal me, how does it give me information that I don't already know? And that's answered with, First Sight it's part of this psi function that everybody has that's constantly gathering information from. It's like, the pre-modern internet, really, maybe dial-up. But just like that girl or that woman who's trying to find Carpenter while he's at the gym, she's tapping into this pre-modern GPS system that, just like, it's not like, it's like take a right. Well, I mean, literally, yeah, it is saying take a right here, take a left here, go straight. There's this car in the back. You've reached your destination, and he talks about how this distinction between consciousness and unconsciousness, and how more oriented you are towards conscious manipulation of objects and life events. Just the more conscious and intellectual, I guess, you are, more egocentric, maybe, I guess you'd say, in the original psychological sense of, like up in your mind, then the less likely you are to reach out to that kind of information. And so you get a sense, like Dean Radin wrote about this in his book, Modern Magic. I think it's called Modern Magic, how what he was studying in the lab, all this parapsychological phenomenon, when he started to look through the anthropological literature and looking into history, he realized that he'd spent 40 years studying magic.
Yeah.
This was basically the only thing that, pre-human tribes really had to rely on. They couldn't Google things, but magic and all of these different gods and goddesses, messages, myths, and all of this stuff played a much more important role in a world where you didn't have explicit definitions, you didn't have explicit technologies, and you didn't have a conscious awareness of matter and how to manipulate material. You had to rely on this function, this psi function, and it was probably a lot stronger then, but I mean, I'm not saying that it was any more reliable, because obviously it led to all sorts of different kinds of crazy witchcraft, and who knows, I'm not an anthropologist myself, but it's really interesting to see how people can fall back on that system, in times of need and in times of crisis. That system is always there. I'm going to try and continue my thought. Sorry, technical
We're talking about
difficulties. Magic. But as Carpenter writes in one of the final chapters of his book, this psi function doesn't give you concrete intelligence, but like any other science, it could possibly give you some sort of a practical technology that you could apply. So just when I was thinking about the difference between now and then in terms of prehistory, more mythological, magic-based societies that honor these higher, I guess you could say maybe higher aspects of human consciousness, that this theory, I'm not saying that it paves the way towards that kind of a breakthrough, but it is suggestive. I mean, that maybe there is some sort of a spiritualistic science that humanity could find. That there is something there that isn't just magic, isn't just witchcraft, isn't just ritual, but that there's something there that people could practically use if they were aware of how to use it. Like these charged situations we're talking about in the psychotherapeutic situation. If you could be consciously aware that this kind of information you could access this kind of confirmation or information, and you could apply rigorous tests to it. Just make sure you're not believing any airy-fairy lie that's coming through a dream, but that people could access this kind of information from a higher, more broad perspective than we have as just little specks on Earth.
Yeah, because one of the points he makes at the end of this chapter is that he asks the situation of, or he asks the question of, whether an awareness of this kind of thing happening in specifically the therapeutic relationship, if that will affect like the therapists themselves, like opinions and beliefs. And he said that basically a bunch of the previous therapists engaged in this kind of research or just practice kind of thought, once people are aware of this, everyone's just going to get along or get it and start realizing these situations. And he says, I think it was Jewel Eisenbud, who is a psychotherapist in New York, also a parapsychologist, who said that. But then Eisenbud was kind of disabused of that optimistic hope, and Carpenter himself says he had the same experience, that he'll talk to other therapists, and he says there are two groups. There's one group will say, "Oh, that's really interesting. Oh, and listen to all these experiences that I've had that are just like that. Oh, isn't that cool?" And then there are the people who just give him a blank stare and are just like, "This guy's crazy." And they according to them, they have never had an experience like that, and it's impossible, and et cetera. And so he kind of wonders if, it might be the case that these other therapists, don't actually have experiences like this, and maybe it is only the ones that are open to it, that actually that openness and that openness, and he gives two other features I can't remember, might actually contribute to the experience happening. So I think, so your kind of speculation of what are the possibilities, I think that you can get a precursor of that in just looking at what already happens in the world. So if you just look at the psychotherapist community, you've got all these psychotherapists that are open to this idea, and they're actually experiencing this thing regularly, and it's kind of integrated into their life to a degree. And then a whole bunch of other people who are not. So I guess the question would be, well, if this were kind of accepted on a mass level, there would always be people that would reject it, presumably. But if it were accepted on a mass level, what kind of effect might that have? Would we just be seeing more of the same, or would there develop a kind of a more specific, a specialized, field where maybe new things come to light, or who knows? Well, just thinking about it in terms of some of the PK studies that have been done, because PK is pretty expansive. One example of that is just I think they call it mental influence on biological systems or something like that. Talked about it last week. Basically, where there might be a microbe in a petri dish, and you're trying to make it do something or something like that, or there are prayer studies. So you get a group of people who are praying for a person with a certain disease, and then you have control groups, and then so you look at the patients who were prayed over and those who weren't, and they've found actual effects where it seems like praying actually does work for people. So if you had more people aware of this, so already, coming back to my previous point, there are already a whole bunch of people who believe prayer works and who do it. and presumably having some effects. So it might just be more of the same, or it might be like some revolutionary new thing where you have like national prayer groups who are doing this kind of thing, and who knows, maybe they might have some increased effects. Who knows? But I think so. Really, one of his main points is just that that this does happen, and it does seem to fulfill a meaningful role in this kind of specifically in this environment, in the the relationship between a therapist and the patient. But maybe prayer just triggered a memory in me. I'm reminded of just first a few things that I've heard Jordan Peterson say. For those listening who might be fans of Jordan Peterson and who might think we're crazy for talking about Psy, I don't know what Peterson would say about this. I'll just say that he is a fan of Carl Jung, who was very into parapsychology. Did his original research on his cousin who was a medium, and was interested in these kinds of things his whole life, and who had similar experiences. Like that's how he developed his theory of synchronicity, where I'm pretty sure some of these exact type of experiences in the the consulting room, so very interesting, meaningful coincidences that happened in that relationship. And he has said that how his wife Tammy seems to have like some prophetic dreams every once in a while. And then he describes his own like therapeutic practice, like when he's when he was still doing his practice, and his mindset is, it's pretty standard, and Carpenter describes it. It's being like in this state of openness, and the way Peterson describes it is he listens very intently, and it's this weird kind of like focus but unfocus at the same time, where he's just listening, focusing, zeroing in exactly on what the patient is saying, and then, but at the same time being totally open to what's going on in his body and in his mind. So if he has like the impulse to say something, no matter kind of how crazy it is, he'll just say, "Oh, well, that just made me think of this," and he'll say it. So I'd be interested in actually hearing if Peterson has any stories like this, because I'm guessing he probably does, where he would say something that seems to be highly relevant, and he had no idea how he knew that, like how he knew it would be relevant. It just popped in his head. And that's the way that Psy basically works, like Carpenter says. It just, you're not aware of it. And like he even says, some therapists will think of this in terms of intuition, but they really don't know what intuition is. He thinks that intuition probably is Psy-based. That's where the intuition comes from to a large degree. So just to give some crossover with some of the things that Peterson said about how he kind of does this sort of thing. And then one other thing, the thing about prayer is that I think it might have been in the debate he had with Sam Harris, but he said it elsewhere, and he's describing like what it means to actually pray, or what it means to him to pray, and basically says, like, he gives the example of when you really want an answer to a question, and you're in this state of kind of like existential dread and anxiety, and you're on your bed and just like praying for an answer and just being like, and he says, well, try this out, if do that, lie on your bed and think about this and just be like, okay, I need the answer to this question. I don't know what it is, and I'll be open to whatever comes to mind. And he says, basically, you try that out, and you will get an answer. And you probably won't like the answer, but it will be the right answer. And that too is like, it's a kind of creativity, but it's also, it's intuition. It's, receiving inspiration. All these things are phenomena that we all have experienced in our lives, to a greater or lesser degree, but we have no explanation for them. How does this actually work? Where do these new thoughts come from? Carpenter says it, and I think we said it like in previous shows, maybe even last week. It's like, where does a song come from? A symphony. Where does anything new that enters your mind come from? What is the creative process? Well, Carpenter would argue that the creative process is probably very similar to, if not the same thing, or if not incorporating first sight, these Psy processes. Is where does that new thought come from? Well, it comes from the unconscious. Well, where does that information come from? Where does the unconscious get that information? Well, if it's not immediately obvious, if there's no like physically causal explanation that can be, brought up to explain it, it's probably going to be extrasensory. Well, it kind of has to be if there's no other choice for where this kind of thing comes from. So yeah, there might even be an explanation for inspiration and for prayer, and for the answer to prayers. Where do the answer to prayers come from? Why do they work? Because if you do it and it actually works, well, again, just like like you were saying, what did he say about where do the what come from? The dreams, right?
Yeah.
Where does the significance of dreams come from? How does your unconscious, how does whatever makes the dream, how is it able to give you information that you don't know consciously? Mm-hmm. Well, it's the same thing in all these other areas. It's like, well, where does that information come from? How does the unconscious know it?
Right. And then in the case of this man on the verge of committing suicide, Carpenter was given information that he could not have possibly, unconsciously, possessed. This man, he was just completely and utterly boring. It is possible that he on some unconscious level just, assembled this information and was like, that. Yeah. But I mean, there are plenty of other cases too where you have a dream of something that you have no conscious way or unconscious. There's no sensory information that you have picked up on that could give you the information that your dream just delivered to you. And so then, like Jordan Peterson says, where does that dream get that information?
Mm-hmm. Mystery
solved.
Well, maybe, how are we doing for time, Adam? 1:11. So, okay, maybe we can do a short discussion getting into maybe like the whole evolution thing. It might sound like a drastic change in topic, but we'll try to connect them. So, one of the things that I like about First Sight is that it seems to scale, in the sense that it's not necessarily, well, it isn't just about human nature and human consciousness. I mean, he even argues that it probably applies to every living thing, every biological system. I'd even go further and say maybe it might even apply at all levels, down to the subatomic. But that would be, for a different show, and we've probably already covered it to some degree in previous shows. But if you look at it as not just the nature of, a conscious being, but as something in the nature of reality itself, that for whatever reason, forms like biological forms have this mind, like to go back to Whitehead and Griffin, to the premise basically that mind is somehow fundamental to reality. If mind is fundamental to reality, then these concepts and these principles will be fundamental to reality. So it's not just that, it's the nature of a human mind that it has unconscious and unconscious intentions. It's the nature of reality for reality itself, either in its parts or maybe in the whole, to have intentions, either unconscious or conscious. And so perhaps, we did that show on consciousness and the kind of hyperdimensional nature of the, all the calculations going on to create the patterns in your brainwaves, and how that suggests a multidimensional, higher dimensional, process going on that then gets translated into, brain activity. If we look at that kind of research, and again, going back to, what was the guy, Strange Order of Things?
Antonio Damasio.
His idea that consciousness starts at some point, basically. That's what the consciousness anatomy of the soul guys say too. Consciousness starts at a certain point. I think they hypothesized it's what was it, the amphibian or something, where at a certain point, the brain activity gets to a degree that's complex enough to represent a higher dimensional attractor in the patterns of the brain waves. So when we were talking about Damasio, it's like, okay, well, what about the level below consciousness? So, right? This was the question we were trying to answer, is what about the parts in the cells that seem to be, or single-celled organisms that seem to have some kind of purpose and intention and agency, but they can't be considered conscious. Well, I think this is where First Sight can come into play, is because we as humans aren't just conscious. We're conscious and we're also unconscious. And there are processes of agency and intention that are happening unconsciously. So maybe below the level of consciousness, and in beings below the whatever, whatever breaking, or what's the word, whatever level of conscious, whatever level they reach at which consciousness, comes about, below that, maybe they are unconscious, but unconscious in the same way that we are unconscious. That there are things going on and intentions playing out and behaviors motivated by these intentions and aims that are playing themselves out unconsciously, but are still mind, because your unconscious is still part of your mind. It is still a mental process, and there is still agency, and there are still intentions, and all these things. So if we look at that and we try to think of the unconscious and mind in general as kind of universal to nature itself, and to kind of all the parts of nature, not necessarily all the collections of parts, because again, like Griffin and Whitehead would argue, like a dead branch won't have a mind in the same way that you think of perhaps even a molecule of that branch having a mind, but the tree itself might have a mind, while it's living, a mind of some sort. Again, and those would be kind of empirical questions to discover by research, because but the principle is that that some collections of matter might just be arbitrary collections of matter. They don't have a specific form, and certain forms seem to be what have consciousness. Like there are only a specific set of all possible forms that can have consciousness, and those seem to have those seem to be these kind of fractal creations of forms of beings that are composed of beings that are smaller than itself, and that kind of encompass those beings below it. So that's how subatomic particles make atoms, and that's how atoms make molecules, and that's how molecules make macromolecules and cells and the parts within cells, and that's how cells make an organ or some larger life form, or an animal or a plant, whatever. So if we take these kinds of principles and try to think about the kind of Darwinism intelligent design debate, and try to figure out how these fit in, I think that would be an interesting exercise. And we've kind of already done it in previous shows, just not with the backdrop of First Sight. So maybe just as a kind of preliminary presentation of some provisional hypotheses, perhaps we need to take into account these unconscious intentions in like the individual and like collective evolution of species, because it does seem that evolutionary leaps are they have a purpose, right? The question would be whether it is the purpose of some alien intelligence that is kind of like looking at this petri dish of life on Earth and saying, "Oh, I want this now," So I'm gonna throw in this new species, the stink bug, just to annoy the North Carolinians, or is the intention in the individual and species themselves on some level, and how do you even think about that? Or maybe it's both, or maybe it's way more complex than that even. But so I just think it might be the case that on an unconscious level of like a species, let's take the breakdown of a species, or the category of a species, that life forms exist for a purpose. Perhaps they have their own, at the very least, they have their own purposes, and they might be as simple as, as the Darwinists would say, it's survival and adapting to your environment. There's probably more purpose than that, and I think there's more purpose to life than that, because life seems to have a direction. For instance, towards more complexity, not just adapting to existing conditions, but surpassing those conditions and like growing in some sense in complexity, in intelligence and consciousness. There seems to be a directional aspect to the whole process, and so it may be that over millions of years of like the life of a species, for instance, there are certain lessons that will be learned or not in this unconscious testing of the environment in the service of unconscious aims. And at some level, who's to say that certain intentions aren't fulfilled? And maybe that the fulfillment of that intention, leads to this kind of like tipping point level of consciousness, where it's like, okay, well now that consciousness is ready for something new, and then again that's the important thing, for something new. That's where inspiration, prayer, dreams, that's where all of these subliminal unconscious processes come into play. It's like, okay, well now something new, we're ready for something new. And that something new gets brought into life, brought into the world through some still mysterious process. And that might take the form of, a new or several coordinated mutations of that existing genome to create a brand new like family of organisms. Like a new life form, essentially, or a new something sufficiently new as to not be just a product of Darwinian devolution, in the sense that Behe shows like just the kind of what is possible with random changes, but something truly new, like a new type of cell or a new type of organ, but coordinated throughout the entire body of the new organism, because organisms are wholes. Like you can't just change one thing and expect all these new things to pop up. If there's a whole bunch of new things, those new things need to be coordinated. They need to be like finely tuned with each other in order to work as a system. So I just think at this point that there's probably like it's a two-way process. That it is very important to take into account the potential unconscious intentions of the species that is evolving, and then the source of that new information as being it will be non-sensorially derived in some sense, but then the question is, well, what is the source of that new information? Is it just out there? If it's possible, well, where do those possibilities reside? And do they reside in another mind or in other minds? And are there levels of minds? And do those levels filter through each other? So is there an ultimate mind that filters through lower level minds, as almost like light is focused through a series of lenses, and does that make a connection with lower organisms? And I could go on and on, but I think we might want to just end it there.
I think that was a fascinating presentation. I thought it was a great presentation. Well, everybody, I hope that you enjoyed this show as much as we enjoyed discussing it, having it. I think that's going to do it for us today. Join in next week. I'm not exactly sure what we plan on discussing next week.
It'll be something.
We will be discussing something next week. So tune in, and if this is on video, I hope that you're watching on YouTube and hitting like and subscribe.
That's right.
Have a great week, everybody.
All right, thanks. See you, everyone.
Bye-bye.